We no longer work with a blank page. You can have a blank page now, and the second you type in a word, decisions have been made about type style and size and layouts. And those defaults don't exist in a vacuum. They came from a place. In graphic design, before the digital age, you had actual blank pages that you had to decide where to start.
It started in Egypt. This Roman alphabet inscription has profoundly influenced the Chinese have pioneered the art of printing centuries. Gutenberg was the first to successfully combine all the necessary printing components.
Since the days of Gutenberg, the typesetter in a real sense has been the engineer of civilization. Printers have advanced learning and have molded progress. The printer has led mankind by the hand, so to speak, into the light of modern society.
Okay, let's understand what happened. Johann Gutenberg decided he wanted to produce Bibles mechanically that looked like they were done by hand so he could charge handwritten prices.
Gutenberg had printed a magnificent Bible. But what was more important, he had printed not just one, but 200 Bibles, all exactly alike.
Movable type gave them the ability to set pages, to have different fonts, different sizes of fonts, and it stayed that way for a few hundred years.
Each piece of type had to be individually picked out of boxes, set in lines, justified, made up in form, used on a press. Typesetting couldn't keep up with the presses. World-famous newspapers and small local presses as well were caught in the same strangling trap.
The skills begun by Gutenberg remained fairly unchanged for 4 centuries until 1886.
When on July 3rd, Ottmar Mergenthaler, a German immigrant, demonstrated a machine which today is regarded as one of the 10 greatest inventions of all time, the linotype.
What they have is a machine that has the ability to set lines of type.
When an operator touches the linotype keys, pieces of brass punched with alphabet and numerical characters are brought together into a line, automatically spaced. Type for nearly every newspaper in the world, and most books, is composed by Mergenthaler's remarkable invention.
It was the machine that made mass education possible. It brought the price of books within the range of the average working person. This is the machine over here, and it's practically unchanged in 100 years. I feel if old man Mergenthaler came back, he could probably go over to that machine, sit down, and set up a couple of galleys of type without any problems at all.
I started in production when there was only hot metal, and type was set on linotype machines, and we went to letterpress printing. And when that press ran, the whole building shook. I mean, literally, you could hear it. It would go boom, 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 as the printing paper went through. I would work across what was called a turtle and a form from a journeyman. We'd bring down a layout that was sketched by hand, and then we put together the page on top of the turtle in the hot metal composition, line by line, line by line. It was very tedious and very time-consuming.
The closest cooperation is needed between the page editor and the makeup.
I got it, I gotta get it back there.
Together, they almost talk the type into the page form, coax it, cajole it, to make it fit as they work against the clock.
From an editorial perspective, it was very difficult, particularly for graphics production like photographs, because we had to go to an outside service to get an engraving made, which was one, expensive, and two, very time-consuming.
Printing presses don't have gray ink, so you have to simulate gray using patterns of dots. You had large dots where you wanted black, you had small dots where you wanted lights, and that's what a halftone is.
After the image has been developed and fixed, the plate is now brushed with an acid-resistant powder, picturesquely named dragon's blood. Again, the plate is heated, then cooled, then placed into the acid bath. A rapidly revolving cutter is chewing up unessential metal from the printing plate. And here is the finished plate.
Photographs and graphics were seldom used because of the expense and time required.
You had this unbelievable workflow where all the pieces had to be done at different times by different people and all had to come together on a composing stone where someone put it all in position.
Okay, on one.
The linotype dominated, but linotype machines were controlled by the International Typographical Union that controlled the newspaper and commercial typesetting industries.
Post-war America was in a state of shell shock. The focal point of agitation was an uneasy American labor movement. In 1919, 4 million workers walked off the job in 3,600 different strikes.
There was always this fear of a strike, because if the newspaper couldn't get out that day, you don't get a second chance at printing the news.
Hey, what's this, Joe?
What's what?
Blank pages. Where's the news?
In fact, I have a newspaper here from 1923 when the pressmen in New York City went on strike. All of the newspapers in New York City combined and created one issue, and it has all the logos of all of those newspapers.
Meet the union printer.
Printing is no easy job. We look upon ourselves as just as highly trained and skilled as the men in the executive departments of the papers.
So you think you need a hike in wages, huh?
I don't think so. I know so, Mr. Public.
So the first reason that photo typesetting took over was in the newspaper industry, where they attempted to move away from the union. Photo typesetting was seen as a way around that. And now combine that with the movement to offset lithography, this was a revelation. Also, the newspaper industry had moved toward tape operation, where they could produce coded tapes, run it through their linotype machine, and set the type automatically. You could use a girl for your typesetting, essentially a euphemism for a non-union, inexpensive person.
Instead of fingers on keys, perforated tape does the work, like the old music roll in a player piano.
Automatic, high speed, powerful, accurate, never gets tired, never gets sick.
Light is magic. There is magic in the way it is created, in the way it travels, the way it behaves. And beyond the magic of light itself, there is the magic of science, finding new and amazing uses for light.
The earliest photo typesetters began around 1900. In fact, it was discovered in the 1920s, but didn't come into use until the 1950s because of the unions, more than anything else. But all of these early machines were based upon the mechanism of the previous hot metal machine. And they were kludgy. They were mechanical, they were erratic. No one really bought them. Two Frenchmen decide to throw all that away and start from scratch. And they read a paper written by Dr. Eggerston at MIT on stroboscopic printing.
We are now in the stroboscopic light laboratory at MIT.
Dr. Eggerston said if you use a camera that's fast enough, you can photograph something that's moving as though it was standing still.
Consider as an example this balloon. With the high-speed pictures, you will be able to see what happens when the knife breaks the balloon.
And they said, well, we could have a font that was moving, and we had a fast enough light, it would go through the character and then expose the photo material. And so Louis Moirou and René Higonnet developed the world's first photographic typesetter, which in 1949 is introduced as the photon machine. and they composed the first book, The Wonderful World of Insects. The first thing done with hot metal was a Bible. The first thing done with photo typesetting was a book on insects.
Cloyster, Bodoni, Bulmer.
It was interesting to watch the transition of the sales and marketing and infrastructure of font production. In hot metal days, that was a very elaborate and complex process of bringing a typeface to market. A lot of steps involved, a lot of manufacturing. You know, it was a big deal. Places like the American Type Founders was a huge factory.
In these casting machines, developed and built by American Type Founders, a metal alloy is melted in a pot that is thermostatically controlled.
The history of typeface design is intimately connected with technology because typefaces are designs, they're concepts of how things look, and fonts are how you deliver that design. So to make a font, you have to understand the means of production, means of how things are being printed, and that's been the nature of typographic history. Monotype and linotype both came out of the era of trying to mechanize type production for an increase in scale and an increase in speed. And since it was work that was done in a factory setting, there was a lot of control with incredibly tight tolerances of how things were produced and how they printed, because when they were manufacturing type at a major industrial scale, things had to be consistent and it had to be predictable. So everything was tested and tested and tested and tested with calipers and micrometers, and they knew how everything worked. The very particular printed color of text that was produced with fonts for hot metal had to be replicated when the companies pivoted to phototype. To do that, they had to investigate what it meant to switch from lead being pressed down onto a surface compared to light passing through film and multiple pieces of film as it was scaled. When your whole production process switches to photography, you have to have photographic masters.
To arrive at a printing plate, the magic word is negative. And one way to get a negative is with a camera.
The master artwork for the typefaces, instead of living on paper, was cut into a piece of rubylith, which it's a film that the eye can see through. The effect of phototypesetting on typefaces was really profound, especially on typefaces that had very fine details. Typefaces had to be redrawn quite a bit. Those fine serifs had to be thickened up and made more square to replicate the effect of letterpress printing that it was originally done for. But look at the difference between those two.
Most phototypesetters ran the same way. They had a font. That font had to be in negative form. So every character or glyph was a little negative. They all moved, so you had to rotate them in some way. They were discs, they were segments, they were strips, they were plastic or glass or film. The reason was that was the way they got around the patents. So they all had to be different, but they all were the same. They were negative characters. There was a timing system that counted these little marks. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's the letter A coming up. It would then flash a xenon flash lamp and went through the character as it was moving, but photographed it as though it was standing still. The light would go through a lens to make it bigger or smaller.
It must be obvious now to those of us employed in the graphic arts that we will, in the next 5 years, undergo more changes than any other industry in the history of our country.
When I first started typesetting, it was a male-dominated field. There were hot typesetters, and they were all gentlemen. And there were some of us new gals that would come in, and we were wearing skirts and that sort of thing, and we were not well received. But we were the cold type department, and that just was infringing on their trade. And so there was a little bit of animosity there. I mean, we were in awe of them because of their abilities and their talents, but they weren't so crazy about us. They did the same work we did, and they were paid double what we were paid. My paycheck said X amount /2, and that meant that I was paid exactly half of what the gentleman next to me was being paid.
slowly but surely, women entered the workforce.
In our shop was primarily women. And the reason for that was the New York typographic industry was primarily union men. We were an open shop or a non-union shop. The men operated linotype machines. Cold type machines was essentially glorified typing to them, and so they didn't want to do it. People that knew how to type and knew how to do this that were excluded from the other shops gravitated to the open cold type shops. So it was probably 80% women.
I think that photo typesetting did more to bring women into the workplace in the printing industry than any other single technology.
Here's another nebulous, intangible area of know-how. I won't use the word creativity here. It's a little overdone. Everybody is creative nowadays. So let's be a little more down to earth and talk about professional art experience and ability. Art ability? Thank you. Art ability and good old-fashioned imagination.
The huge difference was in who did the typesetting. There existed a whole band of very skilled men and women, the compositors.
You would ring the typesetter, you would name your typeface, you would read the text over, and you would get it back. So the telephone in those days was really vital. A really important designer's tool. You couldn't exist without it.
Many a time, I would talk to the typesetter, and I'd say, okay, it's 5 o'clock, okay, but I need this typeset sheet tomorrow. And he said, well, how soon can you get it to us? And I said, I'm speccing it right now.
I don't think people today realize how mathematical and detailed the whole construction of pages was, and still is. It's just done behind the scenes for you automatically. This is a copy of Graphics Master, which was sort of a Bible of the cold type era. You really couldn't see what you were going to get, and you had to specify things way in advance. So you needed a lot of references in order to visualize what you wanted. This is a copy-fitting wheel. You'd actually count the characters in your manuscript, and depending on the line length you wanted and the typeface size, you could determine how much copy would fill up a given space.
If you had an hour to spec raw text, I'm talking like this, right? From this generic, maybe Times Roman at the time, or even, Helvetica, there was a lot of design thinking already at that initial stage. Your decisions had to be arrived at quickly to meet the schedule of another vendor. I'm just going to scramble and send it to you by the end of the day. And that's what would happen.
The way it would work would be that the designer or the creative director would come up with an idea. First thing that was generated was the copy. That would get typed up on a typewriter, and that would be sent to the designer. And the designer would start sketching out ideas, how they saw the layout. They would narrow that down and start doing more refined comps. All of the type had to be specified. Needed to figure out what the font size was, what the type style was, leading, etc. All of that information would go to the type compositor, and that person would retype into a photo composition machine. The output of that would be type galleys. There would be these long strips of paper that would have columns of text in it. Meanwhile, other parts of the layout would be developed, such as photography, lettering, or illustration. Once those came into the production artist's desk, they would need to figure out what the size was, where the cropping was. Once they figured out the percentage or the size of the illustration or the lettering or the photos, they would shoot that on a photostat camera to the actual size that it would be used in the layout. At this point, all of the elements, the photography, the type, the illustration, the lettering, all needed to come and be pasted up onto the mechanical. Once the mechanical was done, it would be sent to the printer. In the pre-press room, they would shoot the mechanical on a large format camera, and they would make negatives out of it. At this point, the FPO photos were replaced with the actual photos that would be used in the printing process. All of these negatives would be stripped together on a large sheet of orange paper. The image at that point was transferred onto a metal plate, which was then used for the printing process.
The first step in this operation, then, is marking up copy for photocomposition.
We'd get a manuscript in, and then we had to put codes in, because in those days there was no WYSIWYG. You couldn't see what you were doing. It was just a bunch of codes.
You had no typewriter paper, and you had no screen. So you were typing blind, called idiot keyboarding, if you will. So a whole new function grew up called the markup person. And they were very important in the process because the operator just followed those instructions as they keyboarded everything.
The best markup people actually had a vision of the page in their head. If you said style 2, style 3, and then at least one of our operators could envision that exactly in her mind. I always thought it was quite extraordinary.
This is the markup procedure used to set a paragraph in Spartan Book Roman type, shown as number 4 grid, 22 picas wide, and in 12-point type size.
For markup, I knew what I needed to do. I would have to get the correct font, and I would have to set up my little punch tape machine, and then I would just input, but you did codes. You would say Bell F, that was for font, and you put in whatever number that particular font was. And then Bell L was for line length, and then just input the type itself. You would take the punch tape, line them up, take them down to the VIP printer.
The input tape is loaded onto the reader of the control unit.
Bring them into us, the operator, and we would thread the tape through the machine, and inside the machine there would be a drum, and on the drum there would be fonts, which would be a plastic card the size of a business card that would have an alphabet on it and symbols, and one would be Helvetica, one would be Helvetica Bold, one would be Palatino.
There are 18 font grids in this turret. Faces of type can be changed by simply removing a grid and replacing it with one of the desired font.
We would be spinning these drums wearing white cotton gloves so we didn't get smudges on them.
And it was all coding. Nothing was WYSIWYG back then. But if you got that coding wrong, you had massive amounts of white blank paper coming out of the proofer. So that was very unfortunate.
In a day or so, they would send back galleys, which were paper proofs. You'd have to lay it out on the pages, determine if it was long, if it was short. It would then, before you'd send it back for a revision, it would either go to the designer or I would make some comments based on the rag, eliminating the widows, different kerning and spacing kinds of issues, and the galley would be very, very detailed, marked up, go back to the type shop, wait for another galley, hope it was really close. You hope it didn't have to go back more than twice because it was so expensive. If you couldn't manage that, you'd be out.
It was almost scary when that package comes in and you're almost afraid to open it up. Like, you know, it was like, because you know you're going to be on the phone. You're going to be able to say, well, that's what you wanted. No, that's not what I wanted. What I wanted was this. Did you understand? Well, you make these proofreading marks like, oh, I didn't understand what that mark was. You're bringing back terrible memories.
Every shop where they did paste up, they had someone known as the magic knife. 2 letters were in the wrong order. There are people who were so good with an X-Acto blade that they could cut those letters out, move them around, and tape them back down. And you didn't have to go back for another proof, shoot it to film, and then restrip it.
I remember Aaron Burns, he would come over, and you have to take this for the time it was meant. He would look at what I'm doing and he would say, "Sweetie, can you move the period over 1/4 of a point?"
I always kind of chickened out and said, set to fit. So the typesetter would figure it out for me. And that's where I started to realize that your typesetter could make you look so good. They had the talent and ability. They would catch your typos. They would proofread everything for you. They would call you on the phone and go, "Are you sure you want this?" When you walked into that final presentation with your work, you were going, "Look what I did," but you knew in the back of your head that somebody else was making you look really good.
We, of course, had to do paste up. That was part of the game.
I saw a brochure from a university down in Kansas. They were teaching a paste up. And I thought about that. I thought, paste up? Maybe there should be a seminar. So that got me thinking. And I tried it out in 1971 for one day, and I had 30 people come. Hey, and during the 70s, that was our kind of golden years. The things that we made were made strictly for paste-up. T-squares and paste-up boards, grids, burnishing tools, a lot of that, and wax and waxers, technical pens. Well, people wanted to buy those, you know. Oh my, that pen I showed would demonstrate that, and yeah, where can I get that? Well, here's the catalog.
Good news, you don't have to be an artist and you don't need a college degree to be a keyliner. You do need proper tools and equipment. And for that purpose, we're showing you the kinds of things that you may need in your shop.
All my tools are still here. Ruling pens, compasses, definitely a set of French curves, an adjustable angle, and of course, the trusty T-square.
Every morning I would come in and I would shake my rapidograph and get the ink flowing to the tip, and I would start my day.
This is what we're going to do. And I'm going to show you, even as a beginner, how simple and easy it is to do.
First step in the process would have been to align your paste-up board on your drafting table. The boundaries of it were done with a non-repro blue pen, and it was kind of this turquoise sort of color that you could write on, but the cameras wouldn't see it. So everything I'm doing is manually drawn.
We now have our road map taped up on the board so we know what to do. We have to literally cut each chunk out, place it into position as you see on this layout. How do we do that? Well, the first thing we need is an adhesive.
Now, a lot of people were pasting up back in the old days with rubber cement. That's what we used. And along came a fellow in Chicago that invented a waxer, which had a little roller, and you plugged it in, you put the wax in there, and it melted, and you could roll that roller onto the piece of paper.
I remember the waxer, putting the hard bars of wax into the waxer and, you know, kind of waiting for them to melt. You know, it was kind of like putting a stick of butter into an already existing bath of warm butter, and you kind of see it kind of melt in, fade away.
Now we lay that galley of type on the board. We have previously, for purposes of condensing the time on camera, trimmed out the artwork.
You know, you'd arrive at work in the morning, you'd have like long scrolls of typesetting that was an entire book on a long scroll. There was these kind of cheap paperbacks that you might buy at the grocery store or something. And it was my job to cut those galleys apart and lay out the pages. So, you know, you had the boards with the non-repro blue outlines of the outside of the pages and all the crop marks and the depth. And you always want the two facing pages to be the same number of lines on facing pages. Really basic typesetting stuff. It wasn't anything fancy.
At that time, it was very common to use clip art for a lot of graphic design, and companies would subscribe to a service where they would get monthly types of clip art. This artwork was kind of precious because you were paying for it. So what you would do is you would send it off to a cameraman and they would shoot it, and you would get a PMT or a stat that looked like this.
You didn't just look on the screen and say, do I like that color gray or not? You had to say, I want a 50% gray screen or a 12% gray screen, etc. And even the line screen, the amount of dots per inch was something you had to specify.
You would have to build each one of the colors separately. One color on a sheet of acetate, such as this, and then the keyline color would be on the board itself. And a lot of times you used a material called rubylith or amberlith. And what that would indicate to the cameraman was this was a piece of artwork.
The photostat machine was a very big part of the production department. It was a very big machine. It must have been about 8-10 feet wide. It had chemicals in it that had to be changed every week. The way it worked is you would get the actual final artwork, you would put it in the camera area, and then you would shoot the photostat, which would be developed instantly and come out. And what that was just used to scale and reproduce roughly the image.
And as long as you have technology, there are always going to be unintended consequences that turn into something that's more significant than what the intention was. But the tool that I was most excited about was the Stat King. It allowed me to create for a short period of style. For the magazine I did, Rock, I used continuous line screens, which were horizontal or vertical lines, and I would take halftones and put them on Kodalith paper that had a solarizing effect. And I would use that for the covers that I would then cut rubies for and get flat color, hand coloring, and then put it all together on a board.
And in those days, every bit of artwork you did had to be scaled, and proportion wheels were on everybody's desk, because figuring it out mathematically didn't make sense when you had this nice little convenient way of determining exactly what percentage to do.
You'd write FPO just so that the printer doesn't mistake it for final artwork. So it was really important.
This is for a magazine called The Rocket, and the way it was set up was, okay, the photographs were done in a photo booth because we didn't have any money to hire a photographer to take these shots. I Xeroxed off those photographs and stuck them down here, and I wrote FPO saying that these are for position only. These are to tell them where a halftone reproduction of that photograph is supposed to go and exactly how to position it. Then I cut an overlay with amberlith that it was supposed to knock out and be printed in a color, in this case green. And then this is all the typography that gets knocked out in colors. You can see very clearly how I sliced it all apart and made it curve around and everything. And then this was the key line that I put on the top, and it's a piece of tissue paper, and I take marking pens and indicate how the colors were all supposed to work.
The thing that was most exciting was always the cover. At Screw, every cover was an illustration. It would be up to the artists to come up with what colors they wanted, and we'd match them with PMS colors.
I would be hired to design a cover using hand lettering as a basis plus illustration to add to it. I was good with a knife, I was good with ink. So inking something and then laying down color and carefully cutting it and then overlaying more, that just sort of became my way of doing it. Here's a title from a National Geographic book called The Story of America, and this was one of the pieces from it. This was inked. This is a film positive of that inking that we could produce for the black plate. And then the artwork is a print of this same thing, identical, in register. All these stars are cut out of overlay film, which is a sticky back, transparent film that you put down, you cut with your knife and peel away what you don't want.
Das, was wie Airbrush aussieht, ist einfach ein fotografierter Verlauf. Und diesen Buchschnitt, den habe ich ausgeschnitten und einfach auf den Hintergrund gelegt. Man musste nur die Schnittkanten, das musste man sehr gut machen. Und da an den Schnittkanten hat man ein bisschen, wenn man was gesehen hat, den Schnitt vom Messer, dann hat man das weggepunkt. Das sieht kompliziert aus. Also der Schatten ist echt, den habe ich so von der Beleuchtung her gemacht. Und den Umschlag habe ich hier rumgeschlagen, nur hier habe ich ausgeschnitten und das drüber stehen lassen. Also es ist sehr einfach und ging auch sehr schnell alles. Da habe ich ein Foto gemacht von Wolken, habe das Buch ausgeschnitten und das Fenster auch und nur draufgelegt. Der Untergrund ist ein Foto, was ich von einer Kollegin bekommen habe. Aber da das nicht groß genug war, habe ich dieses Foto reproduziert und immer per Fotomontage vergrößert. Und dann ist, wie bei dem anderen Plakat, hier dieser Buchschnitt einfach nur draufgeklebt. Und da habe ich einen Kreis ausgeschnitten und dann habe ich ein bisschen mit Abstand, dass es unscharf ist. Also man kann das ja manipulieren.
Now, all we have left to do is affix all of the various elements. So we'll start out with pasta, and that fits right in there. Then we take pizza, that fits in there. Take fine wines, that fits down at the bottom. Beef and veal goes in here.
Then you would cut that out and apply it on your pasteboard. They didn't have the ability to put drop caps into text, so you would have to physically cut out your drop cap, and you would have to plan for a space for that drop cap. And then on your paste up, you would put those two together.
If there were any ruling or lines to be done, I had to do that myself with rapidographs. On vellum, you'd overlap the corners so you didn't have a blobby corner, making them perfect. And sometimes that was very time-consuming.
I hated doing paste up. I was terrible at it. It required such precision and a lot of injuries with X-Acto knives and hot wax everywhere and putting every page number by hand.
I seem to have lost my little piece of art here. It's probably underneath a straight edge, so we'll pick that up. The important thing is not to panic. Whatever you've lost, it's around here somewhere. Here we have our piece of art. So we'll place that into position, make sure that the vertical is indeed vertical, and there we have everything in place.
But you had to burnish it. If you didn't burnish it, you know, it's not going to stick.
Depending upon the complexity of the layout, sometimes you had many acetate overlays.
This was a poster announcing a lecture that Kathy McCoy was doing in San Francisco for the AIGA San Francisco chapter. And this was done in 1987. I actually have the mechanicals. Okay, so there's of course the overlay which has the color breaks. For example, it says here 100% yellow lines, which are these diagonal lines to your left. So that's 100%, but then this frame here is 40% yellow. So you would think, if you have two colors, shouldn't there only be two overlays? Well, this is all done by rapidograph. Look how thin this is. I had to make sure this was actually glued straight. These are a series of dots that were all kind of glued together with my waxer. Okay, and this is the best part. Look at these letters. They were all cut one by one to follow a contour. FPO, for position only. This is ruby lith, 66% because I wanted it lighter. And the printer was very aware that, he would have to shoot this separately, but there were, of course, all these registration marks. I love to do this. It's like a cut and paste collage, really.
Overlays for every different color break, maddening. I don't miss that at all.
This combination of bits and pieces of typography, lines, painting, bromide prints, and traces are instructions how to convert that into plates that will print in cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, the four basic colors, which then mix together to create a full color page. That is the kind of thing we did day in, day out.
Stylistically, one of the things you'll notice in the early 80s, 70s advertising, is you saw a lot of this separate headline, bold. And you think about the Volkswagen Lemon ad. You've got the image, and you've got the headline, and you've got the body copy, and none of it overlaps. I mean, it's a great concept, but production-wise, it was very easy to do those ads because nothing overlapped. If you had to send something out to another place to be knocked out and turned around, that was another day. When I had 20 ads that I had to get out in 2 days, that was it. It worked. The style of it, too, kind of drove a lot of style. I remember leaving one of those full-page ads in my car on a hot summer day. And it got really hot in there, and that glue just releases. And I came back, and everything on the page had slid on the seat. And my whole layout was gone.
If you thought stripping was a term applied to burlesque, it can also be used to describe the trimming and positioning of a final negative, or flat. Great care must be exercised to position the negatives exactly, for a mistake here can result in costly waste and spoilage when the material reaches the press room.
You would send all of the original artwork, the original photographs or original illustrations, and it would go to the printer, who would then have some of those images shot with a camera and stripped in to the negative that shows all the types. So it was really up to the printer and the stripper to do a lot of that.
When we used halftones, they were consisting out of 4 different colors: magenta, cyan, yellow, and key or black. They are black dots on see-through material. But they describe the red or the blue or the yellow. So when you add them up together, you get the halftones. So what you have is, in the end, 4 films, completely registered, completely fitting on top of each other. You check them by putting them all together and making, for example, a proof. Then you copy them onto a light metal, some kind of alloy with a surface on it that reacts to the film. It gets lighted on there. There's some chemicals on it which will only print whatever is on the film. Once you have a film, you put it on the metal, onto the alloy with the chemicals on it, and from that you print.
They would put it all together and send back what was called a blueprint, which was blue and white. It was just to review and proofread. Once that was approved and you had to sign off on the blues, as we call them, then the printer would go ahead and make the plates and send you color proofs before you approved everything. At that point, I usually went to the press run to make sure the color was right, to make sure the registration was correct. So it was an extremely time-consuming process.
Here's a better way to put words on paper. A remarkable electric typewriter, the IBM Selectric.
For small shops that are doing forms and simple stuff, they start to use the Verityper to produce the art for that. Small printers, small typesetting services, small newspapers. They don't need photography, they don't need chemistry. Everything is done right in the typewriter, and it will justify. In 1968, IBM came out with the IBM Composer. It was a version of their Selectric typewriter with the type element ball that could justify. The problem is they had very few typefaces.
Other than payroll, the most dynamic expense that you had was you had to keep pace with type releases. The source for most new releases of typefaces was the International Typeface Corporation, ITC. They would come out with a new typeface, and not just one face, no, it would come out in 4 different weights, plus italic, plus condensed, plus italic, plus outline, ultra bold, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it would be a total of about 16 different weights that you had to buy, because as soon as they released it, the designers wanting to stay hip and fresh and on top of things, would send in manuscripts spec'd in these typefaces. You had to go out and get them immediately. And if you didn't have them, you weren't going to get the job. And it was just that simple.
Making a 2-inch film strip of a really wild typeface was not a big investment. So suddenly there was a huge outbreak of new type designs from all over the world. Dry transfer type, same thing. Companies like Letraset did some very unique and unusual designs that wouldn't have made sense in any other era.
So what we call a frisket is this masterpiece of artwork cut on a piece of ruby leaf, cut out with a knife so that you have incredible precision of line, and it's the crispest version of what would then get reproduced and softened. This is how they worked at Letraset as well. It wasn't just about making films for typesetting.
That was a skill in itself because your characters wouldn't have passed muster unless they were absolutely spot on.
Stencil cutting to us was in some ways an end in itself, and I think that some of the artworks of stencil cutting are literally artworks. You know, could put them on the wall. But all it was at the time was just one stage in
the production process, yeah.
This is just how you got from something made with a hand to a photographic master that you could reproduce.
The company were really very keen that we should interpret the type founders' types. We weren't designing typefaces at that time. It was interpreting very well-known types. So we went to the expense of buying the cast type from the foundries. We joined A Type I, and so we had a license to do this.
How about a modern, fresh design with overtones of the now generation?
And after a little while, Letraset was creating more new faces and launching new faces than it was relying upon metal faces. I mean, one of the titles that was given was The Liberated Letter. You've got to remember this was in the 60s and 70s when there were lots of other things going on associated with design, such as music, fashion, and so on.
The Letraset typefaces were great typefaces. These were now available to everyone who had a couple dollars to spend and didn't know how to set type or didn't know how to do a mechanical.
Letraset was a product and photosetting was a service. And that was the main difference. And Letraset was cheaper than photosetting, but it was quick. We used to think Letraset was for the professional user without realizing that it was a very democratic product. And students could use it, or people who were not familiar with typography. We used to stick our noses in the air if we saw bad typesetting, but in reality, it set about a new wave of typography.
To say that Letraset is an amateur product, I don't even consider that a criticism. It's a great democratizing effect about Letraset that I love. When you don't have to go to a third-party vendor to set your type, when you can just go to an art supply store and buy some letters for a few dollars, you can make a poster for yourself. You can make a magazine for yourself. What's incredibly important about Letraset in type history is that democratization. And I even see it in ephemera that came out of fringe communities who were able to do things. You know, you look at like the Black Panther magazine, you look at queer publishing and all kinds of people who just had a little bit to work with or maybe had trouble finding professional vendors who would do their work. The only way to do it was to use those methods and materials, Letraset, paste ups, photocopies.
You can divide all phototypesetting into two worlds: display, big type, or text, small type. They would deliver strips of headline material exactly the way it was done in hot metal, and the designer would paste all that up. However, with photo typesetting, you could do something you couldn't do with hot metal. You could kern.
One of the pieces of equipment that I found taught me the most about type was a phototypositor. You'd position the type, and then you'd decide to print that letter, and then you would move that, and you'd position the next letter, one letter at a time.
The chemistry was built in, so as you were exposing the letters, they turned black inside the machine. You looked through a little viewer, and that was a reference point for the next letter.
Every single letter was a unique decision. How does this look in relationship to the previous letter, and how do I think it's going to look in relationship to the next letter?
It allowed you to have tight spacing and remarkable kerning, and that's what the designers wanted, tighter and tighter spacing. So if you look at all the design from the 60s and 70s, the typositor made it all possible.
You could smash type and overlap type. And so anybody who was a fan of Herb Lubalin, as I was, could approximate what Herb was doing.
Because photo composition allowed for lenses that zoomed instead of fixed focal length and things like that, they started to introduce the ability to set multiple sizes, multiple typefaces, all on the same piece of paper.
We would sometimes send out lettering that we'd distressed. You know, we'd put a kind of rough edge on lettering, and the printer would come back to say, oh, by the way, I've cleaned up your lettering. And we said, no, it was supposed to be like that. And I was actually working at this record company when the first punk bands, again, talking mid to late 70s, the printers could not understand that we wanted things like the tape that was sticking down a piece of type. We wanted the tape left, and they would... So there was always this kind of battle between printers who have this sort of kind of purist notion that everything should be super clean, and then designers wanting to experiment and use odd techniques.
What everyone wanted was to see the page the way it looked when it was going to be printed out. Tons of errors crept in because no one could see what they were doing. The big movement was, how do I get closer and closer to seeing what that looks like before it comes out of the output unit? Now, there was a comedian at the time, what was his name? It'll come to me in a second. Flip Wilson. His girlfriend was Geraldine, and he would go into that voice. What you see is what you get.
What you see is what you get.
John Siebold liked that line, so he said, what we need are WYSIWYG displays. And that's how the term came into being.
When I went to ATEX and we had a team working on the development of a graphics display terminal. It was a big piece of hardware, the size of a desk basically, because again, the components had not been miniaturized.
As time went on, the technology of the photo typesetting machines changed from electromechanical, using lenses and light, to cathode ray tubes.
A synchronized movie camera automatically photographs the fast-moving images as they are plotted and drawn on the face of a cathode ray tube.
The problem is there were no front ends that could make a page in position to drive them. That was the thing that was missing from the industry.
The Siebold conferences started in the cold type era when computer technology first started driving photo composition. Siebold conferences was where companies went to make big buying decisions about what technology they were going to invest in. And in those days, an investment was big.
There were like 300 different machines that were available at that time specifically for this industry. The newspapers didn't want to give up their technology and invest in something very new. Many of the bigger papers hung on until the bitter end. Well, take the New York Times.
When I went over to the New York Times, I went straight into hot type. In fact, I worked on the very last hot metal page at the New York Times.
This New York Times mirror image inlet of tomorrow's Dateline reads backwards as Sunday, July 2nd, 1978.
It was the last night when the last page was done in hot metal.
For me, having grown up with photo setting, it was just a jump back into time.
It marks the last day of an age-old method of printing in this composing room. Using 535-degree molten lead, it sets solid lines of type called hot type. This worker chalks up his sentiments. End of an era. Good while it lasted. Crying won't help.
I remember the day that they got rid of almost all the linotypes that were sitting up against the wall, just dead, waiting to go to Japan. The systems they went to had to change radically.
Switches and buttons, at a touch, bring us into an ever-advancing world of automation, computerization, and programmed electron flow.
It was a huge investment, and we would buy things that were immediately turned obsolete. So we had 2 Cytex machines. We had one still in a box, huge box, and one that was set up to be used.
And Cytex was an old school computer. I mean, it literally filled a room this big. You've seen in science fiction films in the 60s, the banks of cabinets down one wall with the spinning tapes. That was the system they used. And I found it very interesting because wouldn't it be great if all those things would sit in the one box?
It all happened in 1984, 1985. We'd written up a basic functional specification for a page layout type of device. We were actually using IBM PCs with very rudimentary graphic cards. It was going to be a challenge, so we really didn't see how we were going to do it.
All of the images you are about to see on the large screen will be generated by what's in that bag.
I can still remember this. We were working in a little studio apartment down in the Pike Place Market in Seattle. An Apple employee came and brought in 2 prototype Macintoshes out of the trunk of his car. And he said, I think you guys need to play with these things.
And that was the beginning of the desktop publishing age.
Hello, I am Macintosh. It sure is great to get out of that bag.
On Sunday morning, a very good friend of mine knocked on the door and said, Greiman, you're going to get up and go see this computer. And I was like, I am not getting out of bed to see a computer. And he goes, yes, you are. And I was like, where are we going? He's like, Macy's department store. So I saw my first Mac at Macy's department store.
And right now, we'll let you take one out for a test drive.
I stood in line, for a few minutes to use it. And then after a while, Harry grabbed me and just said, there's like a line out the door of people wanting to use this thing. And I was like, well, what is this thing? So I bought one very early on, like a moth to the flame.
What were the steps that led us to this kind of a user interface that we're dealing with right now?
We had this vision of workstations that had high-resolution bitmap graphics and mice, and networks tying them together, and laser printers, and file servers, and just what you see beginning to happen.
So maybe in someday we'll have one of these things in our home, and you can write a letter to Grandma and a picture of the kids there.
Sure. And I think that's at the base of what this whole revolution is about. Everybody can use it.
Mm-hmm. The first people who got interested in desktop publishing were not traditional publishers or graphic artists. Really. They were computer people who said, oh, wow, cool, now I can do graphics and I can do bitmaps. And so the early folks in that field were not really the traditional people saying, oh, this is cool, I'm going to make this. There were a few that recognized it, but mostly they were kind of geeky computer people. It took a while.
Coming from the Swiss training, learning about grids, learning kind of the discipline of design. The Mac was like a great liberator of not only just what you could create, but your mind, because it would just not do what you wanted, or it had its own kind of thinking. And then you go, well, wait a minute, actually that's better than what I was thinking. Or sometimes we'd shoot off the monitor, then we'd print it out, then I'd do something else to it, then scan it, get it back into the computer, and let it be. I was just crazy. So I got very interested in starting with an idea and then just letting the tool lead the way, kind of co-creating or co-thinking with the technology.
First, when I was in San Francisco, that was where I landed, 1979. I had no idea that the epicenter of design was moving from New York or the East Coast to the West Coast. And in fact, at the time, there was the California New Wave. They called it Nuevo Huevo, and it was in keeping with the magazine that April was involved in, Wet magazine.
I was on the national board of the American Institute of Graphic Arts, AIGA, and one meeting, the elder New York established male graphic designers who were also on the board at that time. Something came up about computer, and they just said it was like the worst thing that had ever happened to the profession, and that they would stick with their pencil. So there's probably a quote out there somewhere for me that the computer's just another pencil. That was also not a very popular remark I made. And of course, the loudest negative voices were in New York. In a way, this is a West Coast tool and a West Coast kind of bunch of youngsters.
Every technology that's ever been introduced has met the complaint, it's not the quality of the previous technology, and yet it goes on to replace the previous technology. And if you ask me to this day what quality is, I have no idea. It's in the mind of the beholder.
The Apple Macintosh has received an unheard of kind of notoriety. Our commentator Paul Schindler has some thoughts on Apple's media image.
The two Macs in this world, the Apple Macintosh and the McDonald's Big Mac, have a lot in common. They're both over-advertised, shiny boxes whose contents disappoint. Apple wants the Macintosh to be taken seriously in the office, and I'm sorry, but I just don't think that's ever going to happen. The machine is wonderful, but it's flawed. It's too expensive, it isn't fast enough, and it's in black and white. I just don't get it.
I did what every person that buys a computer for the first time does. They just try not to see it in the room and walk around in it and ignore it as long as you can. I remember that first time with that Macintosh, it was like when Spider-Man got bit by the radioactive spider. He was like, oh my God, I feel pretty powerful here. Also, still, that insecure uncertainty of, is this art? Does it exist? What should I do with, how can I make sure that this is really, in the beginning, I couldn't get used to it. Just the idea, jumping from tactile art on your drawing board to a magic trick.
The first time I encountered the Apple Mac was at college, at Manchester Poly. They acquired, I think it was 2 Macintosh Pluses, and this would be 1985. Not that many people were interested, so we just signed up for every available slot, and I was in that room pretty much as often as I could be, yeah. You just plotted. The first time I used a Mac, and although you thought you were typing in Times Roman or Helvetica, when you output, it was in the days prior to EPS. So you didn't get these nice clean curves. You got this bitmapped look, whether you wanted it or not. And I loved that.
Nobody could accept the quality of pixelized type that was, a seasoned professional at that time.
We were a little cautious when we introduced a computer for the first time. We wanted to get to know it before we committed ourselves to too much work using it. And in the beginning, we used it to do typesetting.
We can't tell that the word manager is in Helvetic and the rest is in Times because the screen representation is so poor. When you print this, things are even worse. On a dot matrix printer, for example, things are still jaggy or entirely the wrong size. As you can see on the screen, the top line is much larger.
While the impact of electronic publishing has just begun in the professional world, it's easy to see its appeal to individual publishers. it's relatively inexpensive and fast. The print quality, while not yet up to photo typesetting, is fine for smaller jobs. But best of all, desktop publishing puts the power of the printed word within the reach of everyone.
I remember feeling like I was learning to walk again for the first time, trying to use this mouse. And after a while, I wanted to rip the thing out of the computer and toss it across the room and go back to typing, you know, bell, star, semicolon, and just typing in code-based commands. But it was coming, and we had to deal with it, and deal with it we did.
People's desire to communicate overrode the technology limitations of the time. And I always thought that was a good thing.
Everyone was trying to learn more about how the computers behaved because they clearly were a time saver. Everyone's topic of discussion was, I printed out a piece of paper, now what do I do with it to make a comp or to make my mechanical?
While the computer came out in 1984, there were only 3 programs on it. There was Mac Draw, Mac Write, and Mac Paint. And so, you know, we would use Mac Write in order to just do some typesetting. Go to the computer lab, you know, set your type, print it out, take it upstairs to the studio, you know, cut out the letters, see what you need, and then if none of those work, then take it down, go downstairs again, you know, reprint it out, and then cut it up and lay it out, you know, do whatever you have to do with it.
Everyone was still in this middle period of introducing digital tools, but the production methods were still all analog and assuming analog means of reproduction.
It was in this kind of transitional period of some pre-digital, some digital. I'm not sure. It's like what you would call that period is sort of a hybrid production environment. We didn't really recognize it as such at the time, that being taught 2 different languages simultaneously, how to mix gouache with super precise tolerances, but also how to, I don't know, lay out a page and get it to come out of an image setter.
I drew up these templates, and then I would output at 200% or 300, 400%, whatever it was. It had a tile option, so you then just stick them together with magic tape. So that you know, the artworks would then be quite big. Sometimes we'd position stuff with you know, extra PMTs or photocopies, whatever we could get our hands on. And then that would be put under the camera, PMT camera, and reduced down to size. You know, the type would come out really nice and crisp.
Now, when the Macintosh first came out a little over a year ago, the big question was, where is the software? And will there be software? Well, the answer now that we're a year into this is certainly yes. Joining us now in the studio is Paul Brainerd, the president of Aldus Corporation, the man who invented the word desktop publishing, and the guy who also brought us the product PageMaker.
It's like a 3-legged stool. There was Adobe, there was Aldus, and there was Apple. If we took one away, it would fall over.
American entrepreneur's dream is to have the right product at the right time with all the right customers lined up. Well, that's exactly what happened here at Adobe Systems in January of 1985, when Apple unveiled its LaserWriter printer.
Historically, what really happened here was I saw the LaserWriter about 9 months before it was introduced and said, this is going to turn the whole world upside down. Went to Paul Brainerd and said, this is what you ought to be working on.
But you need to go talk to John Warnock at Adobe, and you need to go talk to Apple. When I visited Adobe, they had a prototype was to become the LaserWriter, could actually output at high resolution to meet the needs of the professional graphics world. And so the gap between LaserWriters and the professional typesetting had been closed. And in that moment, I knew a revolution was coming.
Paul, if I go out and buy a desktop publishing package, what can I do with it?
What it allows you to do is use your personal computer to integrate text and graphics and put it together on a page and print it out on a laser printer. You get a high-quality result that then can be reproduced on an office copying machine or at your local print shop.
Most of the PageMaker interface and the dialogues and the way it works, the basic functions, came from my experience having done paste up myself with a razor blade or X-Acto knife.
This kind of PostScript interface could be used in a sense to maybe even encroach on the whole typesetting industry. Is that really true?
Absolutely. PostScript was designed with the graphic arts industry in mind. In other words, it does do halftones, it does do full typefaces, ligatures, kerning, all the words that the typesetting industry has been familiar with.
If I look at work done at that period, I'm appalled at the amateurism of some of the typesetting. We were very meticulous, but we made mistakes. And when we did, I thought, oh God, I wish we had still got some really skilled compositors to do this job. We are amateurs. And that was the way it was for some 10 years. However, now we've got the hang of it.
And I remember specifically that leap where we finally figured out that we could compose it on the screen and it could all come out as one. And it was like the heavens parted and the angels started to sing. It was like we didn't look back after that. There was this point, and I was at Dark Horse Comics, where we had to tell the whole staff that they could no longer paste up. They had to do it on the computer. In the early 80s, you saw a lot of this whole movement of stuff just being collaged all together because you finally could.
Here's what happened next. Once we had the ability to use a laser to expose an entire page with everything on it on film, why did we have to have film? Why not have a plate? And so now the plate setters were born, and computer to plate, or CTP, came about. So it was a natural evolution. It only took 30 years, but we went from photo typesetting to image setting to plate setting, and of course now, digital printing.
You can't see the forest for the trees sometimes, you know. I mean, looking back, you can say, wow, this is the biggest democratization of typography, media, and technology since Gutenberg invented the printing press. Hands down.
This process that for centuries had been a full-scale industrial endeavor in one way or another. You know, it was carving punches by hand or engraving matrices with intricate machinery. All that was done with. You could actually design a typeface speculatively. That was a really new idea, and it took me some number of times to explain that you could actually design a typeface on a lark.
The type publishing process felt like a closed shop, really. And I remember that process because I was there at the time, and we would draw in quite big letter forms. And you would send it off to them, and then somehow it would be made into a usable typeface that could be photo typesetting. But that process was just, we had no idea how that happened. It was a closed shop in that respect. So of course, when Photographer came out, it blew that thing wide open and enabled, anyone with any inkling and desire to make a typeface.
The emigre couple, Rudy and Susanna, came from a great tradition in education in typography. And they were also, I think, one of the most important forces in really making type image. So it was no longer that, there's the beautiful type at the bottom and then there's the image. The type became the image, and type became really kind of editorial, and it could be the main message, and it could have a real personality. It could have many voices. It just became so expressive.
The emigre's doing this. They have a magazine, they're selling fonts. Hey, maybe that'll work to support our magazine habit.
This is the font that first one that I did, this one, Block. And then from what I remember, the kind of really wacky one was Block Extra, which people complained couldn't read.
Stephen Heller wrote famously the article Cult of the Ugly. There was Massimo Vanelli called it The Blight on the Clean Grid of Modernity, which I quoted in the magazine.
I have 4 favorite text faces and about 10 favorite display faces. I don't want any more. I want to get on with the job knowing that I'm going to be using standard typeface equipment. I think the present obsession with designing new display fonts, for example, is absolutely absurd. I take no part in it. I have been responsible for designing some alphabets, but very few. We have all we need in the way of typefaces, more than we need.
Well, there's always something lost, you know, right? I mean, that's a concept from McLuhan, right? Every extension also produces an amputation of some kind. So I guess the question just becomes, like, is the extension worth the amputation, you know?
Do you think anything is lost? And yes, you know, it's the transmission of ideas, the brain to the hand to the fingers. And that motor skill, you know, to move your hand. I mean, now, of course, it's mostly wrist movement. The fact that one is able to, you know, do sweeping movements like this, lifting acetate, cutting. You know, as I said, like, look at my work area. How many inches is this? Whereas when I was doing these mechanicals, I had to have the whole table clear. So I could, like, move up and down, stand up, stand on something, you know, look. It's the layering and the complexity of these hierarchies, right, that I think is lost now, frankly, because it is so superficial. I mean, a lot of the machine is doing all the work for you. Of course, you're giving the commands, which, of course, I'm not denying that the artist, the designer is behind all this, and it's generating the actions, but isn't it great if your body is actually the one doing it?
Being able to directly manipulate type, photography, color, and to be able to see it in real time as you were working, that's what it's all about. That's the revolution. So it's not just about speed to crank things out. It's like a speed that more closely matches your own thought process, your own ability to come up with ideas.
It has been a tremendous success story in the last decades. Everybody designs now, which is great. It's like, you know, not everybody could write hundreds of years ago. Now everybody can write. All kinds of stupid things will be written. So all kinds of stupid designs are in bundles and, you know, ever getting more. But there's still quality design done by real good people, just as there's quality writing right now by real good people. It's much harder to find it now. It used to be that when you looked at some design, it was already okay, because you had to be a specialist. Now you don't have to be a specialist, so you have to really look for something good, which sometimes it's hard.
When the Industrial Revolution had hit its peak, it gave birth to the arts and crafts movement. And I think any new technology is always going to have reactionaries, and it's going to have experimenters. And it's kind of wonderful to see both things come together. Sometimes it comes out as pastiche, and sometimes it's a real distinctive shift in the paradigms.
Let me put it this way. Every time technology takes a big step forward, I take a big step backward. It's like I'm almost down to potato stamps now. The technology's gotten so good, why would anybody hire me when you can do it yourself?
The amazing thing is, this is the studio. That's it. You know, it sounds blasé, but that's the way digital technology has gone means that the studio is wherever my laptop is.
In the digital age, there's a lot more end stuff. You do a sketch, they'll change it. You do what you think is a final, and then they'll say, well, what if we did this? What if we did this color? For instance, you know, if you look at that piece, which is a combination of airbrush, silk screening, and it was big. It was, you know, that piece was about this big, I think. When that was done, it was done. There is like, well, what if the horse is white? You know, or what if the horse is black? Or what if Clint's shirt was red? I mean, that didn't happen. It happens now. That's part of where we are.
I think the whole question of speed is really interesting. I think there's a good side to it, which is that we can work quickly and more efficiently, and why shouldn't we have things, you know, when we need them and faster than they used to be. The problem comes when the clients come into this equation, because clients think, aha, this can be done overnight, or this can be done, I can ask for something and it can be back to me the same day. So I think that's created a sort of culture of sort of panic and endless deadlines, and that's not good, because if you eliminate all thinking time, design really suffers.
There is a tendency now for the client to want to see the finished thing before you've started it, because that veneer of sophistication, that veneer of quality is so seductive that the client just thinks, well, that's easy to do that, isn't it? Just do it.
A piece of software, I guess, necessarily will have to start with some kind of default. Pick up the text tool, you have to start with some kind of size, some kind of font, something. But it implies in this very quiet way that there's some kind of center. And any choice that you make after that is some step away from some kind of mythical ultimate neutrality or whatever. And if you walk into a letterpress shop, there is no center to that universe. And I think that's a more realistic way to think about it.
It took a long time for the digital technology transition to take over the publishing industry and the graphic arts industry. It's just the way transitions happen, industries. Horses went by the wayside, high-end graphic arts systems went by the wayside, and now everybody's empowered.
The art of computer graphics is only in its infancy. Yet it is already stimulating creative thought in far-out areas. It offers not only the means to quicken the pace of discovery, but an ideal way of communicating what we may discover.
We want to see hierarchy, we want to see organization, we want to see complexity, and we want to be led through complexity in a good way. But I don't think that'll ever change. It's just how it's done differently now. It's just different tools.